Okay, let's dive in. Picture this. You walk into a congressional committee hearing, and you can just feel the tension. It's thick.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're jumping straight into the audio from a moment just like that. A real clash. This one between Elijah Cummings and Trey Gowdy.
Yeah, and what's really striking about this recording isn't just, the politics of it all. It gives you this raw look at how these investigations actually work.
It'll work sometimes.
Right, and the fundamental arguments about what transparency even means.
Exactly. So for you, the learner, listening in, this isn't just noise. It's not just political theater.
Yeah.
This deep dive really gets into some critical fault lines, how information gets sought, how it's argued over, what makes a complete record.
And you see these different narratives clashing, why one side focuses on this piece of information while the other side focuses on that.
Totally. So our mission here is to really unpack the core arguments, the specific points where they just lock horns in this exchange.
We want you to grasp why each side thinks their information, their perspective is the key, why it's so important to them.
Okay, so the flashpoint, the spark that really sets this off is Sidney Blumenthal.
Right. His access, his emails, that's the trigger.
Gowdy kicks it off, basically asking, look, why did Blumenthal have, and he uses the term unfettered access
Unfettered, yeah.
to the Secretary of State through email, when Ambassador Stevens, who was right there on the ground, apparently didn't have that same kind of access.
And you have to understand what's underneath that question. It's not just idle curiosity about emails.
No.
He's suggesting maybe there's an imbalance, questioning if Blumenthal's influence, his direct line, was appropriate. It makes you think, okay, who was influencing things and how?
And that's the cue for the Democratic response. They don't just challenge Gowdy's framing.
No, they go after his actions, too.
Exactly. They start bringing up what they call inaccurate statements Gowdy made before, things about the committee's actual purpose, how it was spending public money.
Yeah, and they zero in on something specific. Gowdy said, I think it was on Face the Nation,
That sounds right.
where he claimed his only interest was getting the records, the emails. Said he had zero interest in things like classification issues or, notably, the Clinton Foundation.
Okay, but here's where the Democrats see a direct clash, a real contradiction.
The subpoena.
Yes. The subpoena for Sidney Blumenthal and then making him sit for a deposition. They lay out the dates. Subpoena issued unilaterally May 19th, 2015.
Unilaterally, meaning just Gowdy, basically.
Right. And the deposition scheduled for June 16th.
And how it was delivered becomes a point, too. They claim it wasn't just a polite request.
No, they say armed marshals showed up at his house, served it on his wife.
Wow.
And crucially, they say this happened without first trying to just ask him to come in voluntarily, which they add he was willing to do.
That detail, the armed marshals, the lack of a prior ask, that paints a specific picture.
It gets even more specific. Cummings points out Gowdy himself was at the deposition. He didn't just send staff.
He was there.
And not only there, but personally questioning Blumenthal about the Clinton Foundation, and told his staff to keep asking about it. How many times?
Over 50 times, according to Cummings.
50. So you can see the argument Cummings is building.
Yeah, it's pretty clear. These actions, the subpoena method, Gowdy's presence, the intense focus on the foundation, how does that square with saying you've zero interest in it?
It raises that big question about consistency, right? What's said publicly versus what happens behind closed doors in the investigation.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does Gowdy respond? He defends focusing on Blumenthal and issuing that subpoena.
His main point is, look, Blumenthal sent emails. Those emails had information about Libya, about Benghazi. They went to the Secretary of State.
Right. He says the medium doesn't matter. Email, phone call. He even joked about Morse code.
Which is a bit dramatic, but yeah.
His point is the information itself, the flow of it, that's what's relevant.
And that's a fair point in any investigation, right? You follow the information. Don't get bogged down in how it got there. Focus on what was said.
Okay, but what about that subpoena, the way it was served?
Gowdy's explanation for that was, well, they tried calling Blumenthal, and he didn't answer. So the subpoena was necessary.
So a direct conflict in the narrative there. Democrats say no prior attempt. Gowdy says calls weren't answered.
And you see that all the time, right? Disagreements over who tried to cooperate and when you need to use formal powers like a subpoena. It makes you wonder, what was the actual sequence of events?
Which leads us right into the next big clash. Transparency. The Democrats make a motion.
Yep. They want the entire transcript of Blumenthal's deposition released publicly.
alongside the emails.
Right. Their argument is pretty simple.
Yeah.
If you really want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth,
Which is often invoked in these settings.
then you can't hide part of the record. Let everyone see everything. Full transparency.
And it's strategic, isn't it? Pushing for the full transcript, not just the emails Gowdy focused on.
Absolutely. They want the context. They're implying that the emails alone, without the Q&A, might be misleading.
And they ask, why just Blumenthal? Why pick his stuff to release?
Yeah, why not others? They even threw out that line about, are you going to release the driver's transcripts?
Right, almost mocking the selectivity. Their point is clear. Blumenthal's testimony explains his emails. You need both.
So what's Gowdy's stance on releasing the transcript?
Well, first he raises a procedural issue. Says the parliamentarian, that's the nonpartisan rules expert for the House,
Right. They advise on procedure.
advised that making that motion during the hearing might not be in order. It might need to wait for a formal business meeting.
Okay, so a procedural delay tactic, perhaps? Or a legitimate procedural point? Hard to say from the outside.
But he does promise a vote. Says they'll vote on releasing it at the next business meeting.
And not just Blumenthal's transcript, but other outstanding requests, too. So it's framed as, yes, but later, and along with other things.
Now, his reason for focusing first on Blumenthal's emails, he says, is because they were part of the Secretary of State's emails.
Ah, okay. The ones she herself had said she wanted released.
Exactly. So from Gowdy's view, releasing those emails was just following through on what the other side already wanted.
That's his justification for the emails.
Mm-hmm.
But the transcript, why the hesitation there?
That's where he gives a different reason. He basically says Blumenthal knows nothing about Libya by his own admission. He contrasts Blumenthal's knowledge, or lack thereof in his view, with the people who were there who risked their lives.
So he's making a value judgment, saying some testimony is more important, more relevant than others. Blumenthal's testimony, in his view, isn't as critical as firsthand accounts.
Yeah, and this really shows how transparency can be selective, right? It becomes a tool. Both sides want transparency for the things that help their narrative.
It raises that fundamental question. Who gets to decide whose story is most valuable? Gowdy seems to be setting up a hierarchy here, on-the-ground experience versus, well, emails from Washington.
And then Gowdy turns it back on the Democrats. He accuses them of also being selective.
Oust.
He claims they only want the transcripts of Blumenthal and Cheryl Mills released. But what about, say, the security agents, the 18DS guys, or CIA people? Why aren't the Democrats demanding those transcripts?
Ah, so he's painting their call for Blumenthal's transcript as politically motivated, not a pure call for universal transparency.
Exactly. It's like each side is accusing the other of playing games with the information, selectively releasing, selectively withholding, all for political points.
And that really sums up the challenge in these situations, doesn't it? Trying to figure out how much of the truth that comes out is shaped by who's controlling the information flow.
Definitely. Now, beyond the whole Blumenthal focus, there were a few other things that came up in the hearing.
Right, procedural stuff, other context.
Like a scheduled White House witness, someone named Mr. Rodas apparently wasn't there, and because he wasn't there, Senator Tom Cotton was excused.
Which just shows how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
One person's absence impacts the whole schedule. Who gets to participate?
There was also a question about whether some other guy, a Mr. Hanna, was present, and some back and forth about whether they'd given enough notice for the hearing itself.
Even those small procedural points can become sticking points when things are tense. Each side is watching the process very closely.
And then there's this interesting bit about executive privilege.
Oh, yeah?
Someone asked a parliamentary question about it. Does it apply just when officials testify before Congress, or does it also cover things like media interviews?
That's a fascinating question. What was the ruling?
The chair's interpretation, at least in that moment, was that it seemed to apply mainly to congressional appearances, not necessarily media interviews.
So potentially a different standard of what can be withheld depending on the forum. That's significant. Executive privilege being, the idea that the president or executive branch can withhold certain info.
Exactly. It suggests maybe a different level of accountability is expected when you're talking to Congress versus talking to the press.
Interesting nuance.
And finally, some broader context was thrown in. Allegations that the White House, maybe a former acting commissioner too, were blaming people at the hearing.
Calling them rogue agents, I think was the phrase mentioned.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Which adds this whole other layer, right? Potential finger pointing from higher-ups.
Trying to shape the narrative perhaps deflect responsibility.
And related to that, there was a strong statement that, look, this investigation isn't over. We need to keep digging to get the real answers, rejecting any idea of just moving on.
But then a counter perspective too, right? Someone expressing, okay, let's release all the transcripts with necessary redactions for security or whatever.
Right. While also noting that, at least at that specific moment, they didn't see hard evidence tying the president or the White House directly to the core issue.
But arguing perhaps that if the White House is blaming individuals, well, that just fuels the need to keep investigating.
Exactly. That kind of action just raises more questions, keeps the whole thing going.
So pulling this all together, what does this deep dive really show us? For you, the learner, I think it's a really clear window into just how messy these political investigations can be.
Totally adversarial.
Yeah, you see the competing viewpoints, the accusations flying back and forth, and this fundamental disagreement about what transparency even looks like and how you get there.
It really underscores how hard it is to separate the political strategy from the genuine search for facts in these really high-stakes games.
Absolutely. And you see how differently each side defines truth or a complete record. It's not just about the objective facts on paper. It's how they're framed, which ones get highlighted, which ones get buried.
And who gets to decide that, right? There's this constant tension. You need information, but there are always strategic decisions being made about what info gets prioritized, who gets called, what gets released.
It's all about controlling the narrative.
So here's something to maybe chew on after listening to all this. Think about the power dynamics. Who actually controls the information flow in investigations like these?
Yeah, who decides what's relevant and what's just noise?
And what happens when information is released selectively? What are the consequences of that?
This whole exchange, it just forces you to think critically, doesn't it? About how incredibly challenging it is to arrive at some kind of shared understanding of what happened when everyone involved has their own agenda, their own interpretation of what really matters.